Hi, everyone. Welcome back to your favorite podcast on all things hormones, the Hormone Hacker with your host, Dr. Annette. So, we are continuing our series on the four horsemen of the adrenal apocalypse. So, we are going through all the big stressors that come into play with the adrenals. And this one, the last one, if you missed it on episode 10, was all about sleep. And today we're going to be talking about the blood sugar bandit. So this is looking at going beyond or before we all thought about GLP-1. What was sort of the thief of our digestion? What would have this impact on our blood sugar? What's interesting is that in the last episode, I talked about sleep, and actually sleep disruption is intimately tied into this issue as well, as when we talk about a balanced cortisol, balanced adrenals, and how it affects our digestion and our blood sugar, and even GLP-1. Because you know what, you can't look anywhere without that coming up. And I think it's worth having another discussion about, or at least tying it in to this discussion today. So when I think that I say this a lot, and I think that sometimes I feel like maybe I'm a little bit of a broken record because I always want to talk about adrenals and stress. But you know what? If it wasn't so important, maybe I wouldn't have to talk about it all the time. Or if the fact that it didn't touch everything in your body, probably could leave it alone just a little bit. But how do the adrenals affect our digestion, and how do they affect our blood sugar? What is that implication there, and really what does that mean? I think as one of the things is just to start with the basics. We kind of have in our central nervous system, we have what's known as also the fight or flight, or the rest and digest. So fight or flight is that sympathetic response, and then the parasympathetic response is rest and digest. As you can kind of imagine, sympathetic should happen if we are in danger or we need to have a little more oomph going for us, and adrenaline needs to run a little bit high. And but we're not meant to stay there. And what I think happens a lot is, especially in this day and age, we kind of end up staying there way more than we get out of it, and we're not in that parasympathetic when we need to, so that we are able to rest and digest, as it says. The other one I like is like wine and dine, but maybe we don't want to go there just yet. But the thing about it is if the body is in fight or flight, digestion is going to kind of take a back seat, in that it's not the priority. So if you think about the fight or flight, this fight or flight response, this is kind of, I'm going to rescue your butt response or rescue someone else. And so in that, blood is actually shunted away from the stomach, sent out to major muscle groups. Digestion slows down, so that the priority then is to do whatever is to put out the fire, whatever the alarm is. It's not to be in this relaxed state where we kind of can just sort of chill and have, good digestion, blood sugar balance. But now, if you're really honest with yourself, think about how little you might do that, or watch someone else. Are we, we rush through eating. How many times do we drive through eating? So we're in the car, trying to focus, maybe in traffic, we're eating, we're doing all these things. None of that is very restful. And I've said this before, but if you ever visit, I think, another country, and I think when I went to Italy, it was a great example of food and dinner time. The impression that I got anyways was meant to be savored and enjoyed. Nobody was in a hurry. Sometimes we blame it on, oh, well, they're not working for their tip, so they're not trying to get you out. I don't know, but I still think overall it is a time of day where everybody kind of just slows down and relaxes. So that is, I think, like one of the things that when we talk about this and thinking about a more balanced state, is to make sure that we're fully present when we sit down to eat. We don't have our phones out. We're not watching videos. We're not playing games. We're not watching TV. We sit down, even if you're by yourself. And sometimes that's a little hard for me to do when I'm having, when I have dinner by myself. But I am trying to be more mindful of, I make a dinner like I want, and, not going through a drive-through, and just having a moment of sitting down, taking my time. And actually, being a mom of four, When my kids were little, I don't think I hardly ever ate a hot meal. I got lucky if it was warm. So I am all about savoring that. So I do think like that's step number one, because when we talk about this, the impact that stress has on digestion, part of that slowing it down also usually results in lower hydrochloric acid production. So then we're not digesting our protein as well. Then we feel more bloated, we feel gassy. We got all these other things as a result of just overall poor digestion. Now, to kind of talk about what is this relationship with blood sugar and digestion, because I think this is an important one to consider as well, is that your body is very obsessed overall with blood sugar. So it has this design, when we eat something that has carbs or what have you, glucose levels rise, insulin comes in to drop glucose levels down. As they start to fall, the liver is going to release glucagon to, keep that blood sugar from going too low. But the fact is that if you have a blood sugar dip, that becomes an alarm. And so the quickest way that your body knows to bring up glucose levels rapidly is going to be via cortisol. So cortisol will rapidly bring it up. Problem is, when it does that, it antagonizes the function of insulin. So we get these lingering higher levels of glucose and cortisol. And that sometimes where it comes into trouble with fat storage that's more related to cortisol. And also as we get more insulin resistant, if we continue in this path, if you will. Well, when you're thinking about that, it's sometimes that's why I think it's really important to look at where blood sugar stability is. It is not always high blood sugar. I deal with a lot of women that are struggling with low blood sugar. And so knowing that is, you approach it a little bit differently, and actually eating less or cutting out carbs completely, like our starchy carbs, can actually be more problematic. The other thing about that is that because we know cortisol and glucose go together, that also means that when you're under stress, when cortisol rises, so is glucose. Okay. Now, if you think about it from a survival point of view, that makes good sense, right? Because we know that glucose is our quickest source of energy. It's a lot easier for the body to utilize glucose versus getting into fat stores and all this other stuff. So if it is kind of like, if the brain perceives it as a stress response, guess what? Cortisol and glucose are going to go up. Now, the problem there lies in is this when this happens like chronically, right? Meaning when we have really strong adrenals that are very balanced, what happens in those kind of stress responses, cortisol would go up, so would DHEA, and that would kind of give us this nicer balance. But under prolonged stress or an imbalance, I say stress response, a maladapted stress response, we start to lose that a little bit, because at the end of the day, hypothalamus and pituitary, especially the hypothalamus, is always going to choose cortisol because you would die without it. So it's like, it's one of the strongest hormones in your body. And so it plays a role in a lot of different areas. What I think is interesting is that, when we talk about, cortisol rising under stress, is that it kind of doesn't matter if the stress is real or not. So for instance, if you got worked up about something you saw on social media, or maybe you got worked up about a text that somebody sent you. And so meaning that you're having a stress response, but it's not a true physical threat, your body still responds the same way. Cortisol goes up, glucose goes up. Now, I recognize that this is going to sound, as I'm kind of saying this, I'm like, yes, and we're like, well, yeah, Dr. Annette, but doesn't everybody have stress? Or it sounds like a no-win situation, because we know that stress is going to happen. But this is, I think, where the things that we do, the lifestyle modifications, and I'm going to talk about some of the choices we might make to support that balance of the adrenal response, is what really, really does matter. When I was, kind of looking at, this, again, kind of this GLP-1 craze, right? Like everybody's on it, everybody's talking about it. Forget the fact that, you're going to lose your hair, you might go into gastroparesis, so then you end up with bowel obstruction, potentially lose your gallbladder, could end up with, thyroid cancer. There's a whole lot of nasty stuff besides just the fact that it makes you nauseous, makes you not hungry, and actually has a paradoxical response because you've got something that's causing GLP-1 to go up. And like all things, your body's going to become more resistant to it, which I think really ties into why people really struggle to get off of it. The other thing about it that I have seen, just happen to get lucky of testing someone's adrenals while they're doing a GLP-1, and I see these very elevated cortisol levels, which I think kind of makes sense because if GLP-1's job is to cause an increase in insulin, the insulin's job is to lower your glucose levels, and then potentially they get too low on top of not eating enough. Cortisol is going to cause that elevation, which would also show up in that muscle breakdown or muscle wasting. I think it's where you get more of that gaunt look, that loss of that connective tissue, which also, when you try to get off of it, creates this whole rebound. So in it, I was kind of looking at, okay, well, why, let's just say, for instance, someone does have lower levels of GLP-1, and I'm like, well, why would they? And it's kind of fascinating. So it does tie into, well, maybe their diet. A lot goes back to eating, basically, if you're constantly eating a diet that is high in refined carbohydrates and sugars, then you're always kind of having things that need to bring that into balance, which would be GLP-1, GIP, insulin-like factors, and of course, insulin as well. But then I was like, okay, but there's got to be more to it. We know that, like, everybody can go, yeah. Someone who eats their way into trouble, with type 2 diabetes, we kind of like, oh, that might make sense. But I thought what was fascinating, because the other thing I looked at was the influence of estrogen, right? So it was kind of, as you can kind of imagine, it was like, well, too much estrogen and that's a problem, and not enough estrogen and that's a problem. So there's no solid solution or answer there, other than hormones matter and hormone balance matters. But I did find where there's a direct link to sleep deprivation and chronic stress, which would be that higher than, the cortisol that's higher relative to your DHEA, causes a suppression of GLP-1. And it's kind of like how we start to get back in trouble again. Now, I am always in the camp of, let me know what I can do to make my health better. Like, I am really, really resistant in accepting that it's my fate. I kind of don't believe that. I really do believe that anybody can feel better, live a better life, all the things, but you have to choose to do that. I mean, we know that we got to make those choices to, help ourselves. You can't sit around doing nothing and expecting a change. It'd be silly, wouldn't it? It'd be like sitting around just, thinking about, I really want to go run a marathon. And I mean, this is kind of a bold example, but would you just spend your training days, in air quotes, imagining, kind of thinking about it, talking about running the marathon, and then, 6 months later, just go out and run the marathon? Anybody listening knows that's insane. That would never work. You probably would even struggle to walk the 26.2 miles. My point being is that if we want something, we have to do something about it and kind of start with these little steps. And I think when we're talking about blood sugar and digestion, it's not simple calories in, calories out. And I know I talked about this in some of the earlier podcasts, but it's really not. Our body has to do something with what we take in. So for instance, foods that are higher in protein and higher in fiber, and I'm not talking you got to be like crazy high protein, but higher protein and fiber are more stabilizing to blood sugar. They support digestion, they support our gut health, and also, increasing fiber, for those of you that have, struggled with what we call food noise, that is what's going to help you the most, is increasing that fiber in your diet. And then we slow down, right? We take time to eat. We slow down so that there is time for ghrelin to shift in leptin and GLP-1, that we're not just rushing through it. So our body doesn't know what the signals are anymore, has no clue. In fact, I was bringing up ghrelin. That was another thing that I read about some of the consequences of GLP-1, is that we might see that it's causing ghrelin to kind of counteract that sort of starvation mode, because a lot of people, because they don't feel good, they're nauseous, the diarrhea and all this stuff, they don't eat enough. And so ghrelin is the hormone that tries to tell you, hey, you're hungry, you need to eat. So I do feel like when we're looking at it, there are some very real things and choices that we can make. Not just think about the calories, think about the quality of the calories that we have. And I can also argue, I mean, you could eat really healthy, but eating too much is too much. But and I kind of been thinking about this more lately when it comes to the blood sugar and digestion. So first, I focus on things that are going to support my digestion. I look at real food. I look at how I prepare it. I use things that are going to be very rich in bitters, the bitter spices, the bitter greens, utilizing more beans or legumes to get more fiber and protein in my diet to really help me overall. Okay. And then as far as support that I might include, I take digestive bitters. I mean, you guys can do that in a tablet. I've seen people go to a restaurant and order, like the bitters from the bar and just put them in soda water. And that is a great way to start it. Or having, a salad that is kale or arugula or spinach to start the meal, because it is bitter. Just make sure you don't, smother it with a bunch of sweet dressing. We can also, if we've been under stress for a while, then it might be important to add in digestive enzymes, add in a source of betaine hydrochloric acid, look at, something that might contain L-glutamine that would help, with the mucous membranes and absorption in the small intestine, where we actually absorb most of our nutrients. And looking at those things, when we do bitters, they're naturally going to stimulate bile. HCl will help stimulate bile, which is going to keep our gallbladder healthy. And these are just things that we're all able to do with our diet. And it doesn't have to be, really any harder than that. Now, when we talk about how we might want to balance I think the stress hormones, this is such a big one. And I'm going to be talking about it, maybe until I retire and then some. But, in that, there are things we can do, right? We can make sure we're sleeping. We can make sure that we have our downtime. I look at things like I have an Oura ring. So there are times when I feel like my stress is engaged, and it needs to be. It's just that I don't stay there. I'm not going to stay in this high stress state. So it's kind of having that balance. And one of the things I want to say before I got too far into talking about, balancing our stress hormones, go back to the diet for a minute. One thing about your body and your brain is that it will do whatever it can to keep you alive, in a sense, right? But it doesn't care how you look doing it, right? Doesn't care. As long as you're upright and walking. Part of that comes into if we eat too little of calories and we kind of go into the starvation mode, it tries to figure out a way to either to get us to eat or basically slow down so that our metabolism is much slower, so we are not burning too much energy to ensure our survival, right? So sometimes when we go on a really restricted, calorie diet, like especially for women, when you're getting under 1,000 calories, it's not sustainable long term, because then again, your body's going to start to fight against that. Just like if you, keep, surging a particular hormone, like we've talked about insulin, GLP-1, different things that might affect it, it's going to try to find a way to make things right again as far as it's concerned. So I've thought this, and I kind of talk about it more, it's all good to think about the things that we want to eat, but it's really, really smart to change that up, right? Just like, a good example, I think, or a way to think about changing up what we eat. And I mean, consuming the amount of calories that we eat. If you wanted to get stronger, would you take 2 5-pound dumbbells? I mean, I know this is very low for some of you probably in the gym lifting a lot more, but just kind of bear with me on this. But if you're like, okay, I want to get stronger. And so, at first maybe it was a little bit hard to maybe do 20 bicep curls and triceps, whatever, with these 5 pounds on each. But you did that for a little bit and it got easier, right? As it would, because your body got stronger and it adjusted to it. But what if you never changed that? What if you did the same thing? You did the same thing over and over and over and over, and you never changed it. Chances are your increase in strength, not that it couldn't get better, but it's going to slow way down because there's no challenge. Now take that concept and put it to what we eat. What if instead we did change it up? Maybe some mornings we wake up, we're hungrier than other mornings, so we eat a little bit more. Or maybe we eat a bigger lunch, so we don't eat as much for dinner. Maybe we just have a day that overall it just seemed like a little more calories, but the next day we weren't so hungry, so we ate less. If we were changing it more frequently, our metabolism would never become accustomed to a low caloric state, nor would it get resistant in a high caloric state, because okay, some days I ate 900 calories. Oh, tomorrow I had 1400. Oh, then I had 1200. Oh, then I had 1500 because I was on a bike ride. I mean, if you change it, I actually think that is one way to create metabolic flexibility, and then look at okay, we talked about prioritizing sleep in the last podcast. We know, and I know, as I'm talking to women in particular, I know one, that's a challenge for our moms with young babies. It also can be another big challenge as we go into perimenopause and menopause, because we might have hot flashes, night sweats, and things like that. And to be honest, I mean, that was the whole reason I got an Oura ring, was to figure out how I could improve my sleep. And let me tell you, it's still a work in progress, but it is something that I'm working on. So with that, I'm like, okay, so I can do that with a bedtime routine. We know the calming minerals like calcium, magnesium can help with sleep, and there are certain herbs. Now, what about the adrenals? What about balancing cortisol? Well, some studies have been done showing that taking a short walk after dinner, easy, 30-60 minutes, can help with glucose levels and also with cortisol levels. So gotta love that, right? Some of you, now I think if I ate, I'm more inclined to be able to do an easy walk. I would not be able to do hard cardio, and I certainly don't think I'd want to be doing any really intense yoga or Pilates that might, overly engage my abs and that area. So I think walking makes a lot of sense. I think that, and then looking at, I've said this, a lot of the needs for the adrenals is not too far from the rest of the endocrine system. I mean, the B vitamins. Magnesium is an amazing one for normalizing cortisol, supporting blood sugar, supporting our muscles, supporting, sleep, so many different things. And I know you can get on a rant about it's the most deficient mineral, but it's also a mineral that requires other minerals, in balance. So calcium, magnesium, and all of that. And, what's kind of cool is we got really great food sources, our dark leafy greens, Swiss chard, believe it or not, buckwheat. Buckwheat is a great source of magnesium and a lot of other minerals. Mountain spinach. We can, look at other foods that are rich in it, but I'm always kind of going for what is either, it was so going to be food based when it comes to that. Kind of the cool part, kind of using Swiss chard, turnip greens, beet leaf greens, different things like that. While I am looking at the minerals, I'm also going to get a whole lot of other nutrients out of it. I'm going to get a lot of B vitamins out of it. So again, the more we eat the rainbow, the better off we are. And then I would say that, I think a lot about, what I take, right? So some people are like, oh, what do you take? What do you do? There are things that I will always take. I will always take for the rest of my life. And I do it because I want that vitality. And a big one is going to be the adaptogenic herbs. And you got to I think this is where it's important if you're listening, that if you're not a practitioner and you're not working currently with a practitioner, this is where we can help you figure out what's going to be the best adaptogenic herb for you, because we're all like a little bit different. Um, Adaptogens for the adrenals, a lot of them are also going to have a tonic property. So that means they're going to help tone the gland. But an adaptogen by its nature is going to make the adrenals more resilient and have a better stress response. And that's really what we want. We want to have a better stress response. We don't want to be stuck in a chronic stress response. So I think of a better stress response as like, yes, my body is responding to whatever the stressor is, to whatever level of that is needed. And then it's coming back to allostasis, homeostasis, whatever you want to call it. It's coming back into a balanced state. I think that probably the big ones that come to mind for me are rhodiola, ashwagandha, and schizandra. Those are the top as far as a tonic and an adaptogen. I think when we look at rhamania and licorice, these would be tonics, but they'd also be considered tropho-restorative for the adrenals. And some of these herbs are a little more cooling, so they can be better, depending on what state of hormonal balance that the body is in. Some of them could also be really important for the perimenopausal female because they would have blood building and anti-hemorrhagic properties. But the thing of it is that, when it comes to that, quality matters. So because anybody listening, you could go Google it. You could find lots of companies, marketing companies that say they have any of these herbs, but that doesn't mean that they're using the right part of the plant. Doesn't mean that they extracted any of the phytonutrients that play a role specifically in balancing cortisol, DHEA, and really strengthening the adrenals. So I do think this is when it becomes really important to work with the right healthcare practitioner that can guide you, and also be like, okay, I always look at, you can't go wrong with a high quality adaptogen, but is there going to be one that fits you a little bit better? Like would someone do better with rhodiola and Korean ginseng, and the next person, maybe because of needing more mood support, more liver support, maybe wants rhodiola and schizandra? Or would ashwagandha be for the person definitely who is hovering with both thyroid and adrenal issues because of ashwagandha's influence on the thyroid? So I do think that when we need that support, what are the supplements that we can take that are going to help us feel more balanced? But if you're having issues with digestion, so let's recap. So let's say, for instance, you feel worse after eating, you get full really fast, or you have nausea when you eat or nausea when you take supplements. Chances are that this is probably a relatively less than optimal state of hydrochloric acid going on in the stomach. If you have more gas that's delayed, like a couple of hours after, maybe more bloating, this might be showing up with not getting enough digestive enzymes. And to be fair, you can also have both issues at once. So maybe you go between almost IBS like. You have a little bit of constipation, you might have looser stools, you might have bloating. But I want you to keep in mind, I don't care how long you've had it, it's not okay, right? We should be able to digest. We shouldn't be, super bloated, uncomfortable. These are things that digestive weakness can lead into leaky gut, lead into SIBO, SIFO, and other things like that. So if you've got that, try some of the things. Maybe it's just increasing fiber, and that takes some getting used to, right? Takes some time to get used to increasing the fiber in your diet. You could also make a fresh ginger tea in the morning, boil your own, shaved ginger, and then add a little bit of fresh lemon juice, maybe a little bit of honey and cinnamon. Be a very good digestive aid, really great for nausea, also strengthens digestion, really good for joints as well. So you've got so many things that you can do on your own. What if What if you feel like immediate relief when you eat? And we know who these people are. These are our hangry individuals. So when they eat, they feel better. Well, that's probably a sign of getting a blood sugar low. And you've got to pay attention, one, to what you're eating so that you got more blood sugar stability. Look at, are you trying to be too restricted in the time that you eat? Sometimes we cut off eating too early at night and we go way too long. And that might be another sign, because you can't lose weight. There's, you're not balancing your blood sugar. And again, that can create its own struggles there. So look at, well, do I feel better once I eat? Well, let me look at the timing of what I'm eating. What is equality? A lot of times when we're really tired as well, we crave the easy carbs because it gives us that quick burst of energy, because it doesn't take a whole lot of work. So there's a reason why we crave some of the things that we do. And you might want to, take a step back and look at that. Is that what you're doing? Is it tired? Is that why you want the caffeine with mostly sugar in it? Or, the quick bite of cookie, whatever it is, you will be your best detective. And when you go in and you dig in all of that to see what the body is trying to tell you, you bring that, if you can't fix it on your own, bring that to the healthcare practitioner and then let them help you get sort of, the rest of the way home. All right. That is it. Trying to keep it short and sweet. So this was the blood sugar bandit. And this is highlighting how cortisol affects our blood sugar, affects our digestion, that there is a solution that our body is looking for, and it doesn't come from Pfizer. Just want to point that out. But this is also another one that's still tied into sleep as well. So in our next one, so now we've got 2 horsemen out of the 4 of the adrenal apocalypse, which means our next podcast is going to be about inflammation and its role in when it comes to adrenals, and also how it affects us and affects our overall health. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode on the Blood Sugar Bandit. If you like it, share it, all that great stuff, and I will see you guys soon. Thank you, and it's Dr. Annette here with Hormone Hackers.